Hey everyone, so I'm going to follow up on my video on Marxism generally with the discussion of cultural Marxism, because this is another word, a term that gets bandied around so much in our conversations in political discourse, and I just can't help but think that almost every time I hear someone accuse someone else of being a cultural Marxist, I just think, what are you talking about? I don't know what you are actually talking about here. So if you can relate to that feeling, hopefully this video will be helpful to you, because I do want to distinguish, in talking about this and unpacking this a little bit, I want to distinguish cultural Marxism from Marxism more generally, which is why I'm doing this after the other video. So if you want to watch that video, if you haven't seen it yet, I'll link to, I think I can put it in one of the corners here, you can check that out, in which I discuss what I see as 4 major threads of Marxism broadly. But to talk about cultural Marxism shortly, but briefly, what I want to do is comment on historically a little bit about where it comes from, because I think that helps to wrap your mind around it, to figure out what actually is this thing being called cultural Marxism. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about where it comes from, and then I want to say 3 things about cultural Marxism specifically that set it apart, I think, from Marxism more broadly. So hopefully this will be helpful to you, if this is something that's of interest. But where cultural Marxism comes from is, again, and I'm like really distilling a lot of history and a lot of study that I've done over the past year in particular in these comments, so just know that. But where it comes from is from something basically called the Frankfurt School, which was an academic movement in kind of the early to mid 1900s. So the Frankfurt School, you can Google it, look it up on Wikipedia, whatever, you can find, some broad brush history about that. But the Frankfurt School was an academic movement that was birthed in Frankfurt, Germany, hence the name, that eventually kind of gave way to what we also call critical theory today. So for the purposes of this discussion, critical theory and cultural Marxism are kind of synonymous, at least just for the purposes of this summary. But the Frankfurt School was populated by thinkers like Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, Walter Benjamin. Most of them were Germans and most of them were Jewish, which is an important context. And this Frankfurt School, this academic movement, essentially was birthed to answer a pretty specific historical question. And this is all relevant, I think. So I'm not going down a rabbit trail here for no reason. This is all relevant to understanding why cultural Marxism exists and where it comes from. But the specific question that people like Adorno and Horkheimer were trying to answer was this, and it was, why was there no communist revolution, no successful communist revolution in Germany like there was in Russia? This is not something I knew before studying it, but popular history would tell us, and rightfully so, that there was a successful communist revolution in Russia in 1917, right? The Bolshevik Revolution. Many of us have at least heard about that or have some general common awareness of that, right? What I did not know before studying it is that there was a similar attempt at a left communist revolution in Germany just 2 years later in 1919. It was similar, except in a big way that it was not similar was that it did not succeed. It did not implement a new communist regime. That did not happen in Germany like it happened in Russia. And so the Frankfurt School was birthed out of the question, why did that happen that way? Because if you remember from my Marxism video, a big part of Marxism was this kind of inevitable progress of history, the Hegelian idea, right, of history unfolding. And Marx really believed, and Engels and some other similar thinkers really believed, that this communist view, communist utopia, classless society was a better term. Classless society is a better term than just communist, I think, when talking about Marx's ideas. They really believed that societal condition was just inevitable. History would just go there. Capitalism would eventually give way to this. It was just in the very kind of fabric of capitalism to kind of collapse on itself and produce this classless society. They really believed that. And so the question of, whoa, wait a minute, why didn't this happen in Germany became very pressing to these thinkers of the Frankfurt School. So that's really short, broad strokes of where cultural Marxism was birthed historically. And a really good book on this, by the way, which maybe I'll link to that, my review of it. A great, pretty readable book on this is Stuart Jeffrey's book, Grand Hotel Abyss, in which he tells some of the stories of these thinkers. It's kind of a collection of biographies of the men in the Frankfurt School. So read that if that's of interest to you, or check out my review. That's where it comes from. Now I want to say 3 things about cultural Marxism / critical theory itself that will hopefully help distinguish it from Marxism as a broader worldview or philosophy. And the first thing, possibly the most important thing about it, is the influence of Freud. So that's the first thing of these 3 that I want to talk about, is the influence of Freud on critical theory. That does distinguish it from Marx more broadly, because the main thinkers of the Frankfurt School, people again like Adorno, Horkheimer, later on Marcuse, and Walter Benjamin and such, they were Marxists in their understanding of the world. Their philosophical lens was Marxist. But they were very influenced and admired Freud, who was also German, right? And they were German Jews, and so were very, very influenced by Freud's thinking about psychoanalysis and psychology. That is a layer that's not in Marx. Psychology, psychoanalysis, all that stuff, that's not in Marx more broadly. Again, like I mentioned in the Marx video, Marx was an economic thinker primarily. So he didn't get into all that stuff. But people like Adorno were fascinated by Freud and thought that maybe Freud had an insight to answer the question they were pursuing. Again, the question of why did this revolution not succeed in our country? So Freud, again, this is simplifying such complicated stuff, so I'm doing my best here. But Freud, a lot of Freud's work, which I know has been contested, and there's a lot of elements of Freud that a lot of modern therapists and psychoanalysts would have serious issues with. But at the risk of oversimplifying Freud, one of his major pieces that he dealt with was this notion of repression, right? So things being submerged into the subconscious. He talked a lot about, particularly in a civilized society, how we might repress or suppress things that we want, more base desires or instincts. We suppress them out of kind of a desire to fit into our civilized Western world. And so those things get submerged into things like dreams or whatever, and they can be analyzed in kind of that psychoanalytic way to get insights into what we're repressing and why, and ultimately to be a healthier person, right? So that's a lot about Freud. But anyways, not to get too down to that rabbit trail, but people like Adorno and Horkheimer were fascinated by Freud and wanted to bring Freud's insights, which they saw as valid, into this question of why didn't the revolution succeed, into their Marxist framework, right? And so this is a really important thing. Critical theory, I think it's fair to say that a lot of critical theory is basically Marx's view of the world plus Freud's view of human psychology. To answer the question of why are these revolutions that we think are inevitable and need to happen for the well-being and flourishing of humanity. In the Marxist view, the well-being is this classless society. Why is that not happening? Well, they think Freud had the answer for that, basically. So they imported it into the Marxist view. And this is why it is different. Cultural Marxism, I don't love the term cultural Marxism because it just, again, it's sloppily used and it kind of gets lumped right into the broader Marxist thing. But it's actually pretty different because of this Freudian layer to it, right? And that leads me to the second thing I want to say about it, out of the 3 things I want to say. The second thing is that the cultural Marxists, the critical theorists, by taking Freud's insights about repression and trying to figure out why is this revolution not happening, they turned a lot of their critique and a lot of their primary lens. If Marx's primary lens was on the economic layer, they turned from analyzing primarily economics, they turned it towards culture, hence the term cultural Marxism. And so a lot of what they were discussing was, what if instead of economics being the primary mode of oppression, which again, my first video, that's Marx, right? Those who are dispossessed, marginalized, dehumanized economically form the proletariat, which is the group that needs to be awakened, right? But they kind of moved off of that economic way of analysis and turned it towards culture, but we're saying a lot of the same Marxist things, saying things like, what if there are invisible cultural forces at work that are oppressing people. Cultural, not economic. So what if, for example, something along the lines of gender? What if there's an invisible kind of cultural mindset around gender that is oppressing people of particularly women in this case? This is the birth of a certain form of feminism. There was a wave of feminism before all this, right, with Amelia Earhart and all that. So anyways, that's yet another historical tangent. But along critical theories kind of lines, what if there's an invisible cultural approach to gender that is oppressing and marginalizing a population along cultural lines, not economic, but cultural? And what if that's the group, like the proletariat, that needs to be awakened to their group consciousness to free us out of being stuck in this pre-revolutionary state that we're in, right? Because again, the revolution needs to happen in that Marxist kind of march of history. And it's up to us. We don't have a divine source for that, a transcendent source for that, right? This is how these things are. So it is still Marxist in its kind of some of its base pillars, but it has this really important cultural lens with this kind of Freudian repression kind of flavor to it. And so this is our super important turn, is to turn instead of from economic things, which are, economic is pretty easy to empirically measure. You can see wealth gaps. You can see class distinctions in society. But cultural stuff is invisible, a lot harder to define. But that's what they were trying to turn their analytic lenses on. And they were academics, right? So they were trying to analyze these things in a very academic way, very philosophical way. So that is really an important kind of formulation of this kind of critical theory approach. And the term critical theory, the term critical there is important because they're turning a really critical eye towards these invisible cultural institutions. I use gender as an example, but race is a very similar example that can be discussed. The institution of the family, like some critical theorists would talk about, is our ideal of the nuclear family actually oppressing people? Is it actually keeping people stuck, again, out of this kind of revolutionary mindset? A really famous essay by Adorno and Horkheimer coined the term the culture industry. It's in the Dialectics of Enlightenment. And they talk about how in a capitalist system like in the West, how part of what the system is trying to do is to produce cultural goods to keep people stuck in essentially keep people comfortable in kind of their state, even though they don't realize they're essentially being oppressed. And they need to be freed out of that. And so they were trying to puncture these illusions. So this is kind of the mindset of the critical theorists. They're taking the broader Marxian kind of view with significant layer of Freudian repression and psychoanalysis, and turning their lens from strictly economic to cultural pieces. So if you're tracking with me, hopefully you can start to see where some of our discourse today about race, about gender, about oppression, intersectionality is a much newer term. The critical theorists didn't use that term, but you can start to see how trying to analyze these invisible cultural layers of identity can really come out of some of this way of thinking about the world. So that's really sums up a lot of the goals of the critical theorists. Now, the third thing I want to say about this, so the first thing, again, was influence of Freud. The second thing is the turn from economics to culture. And the third thing is the intentional targeting of elite institutions, particularly universities, so the intentional target of academia. They were academics. They saw that the proletariat revolution didn't work in Germany, and so they turned towards culture. And then what better place from which to analyze invisible cultural things than one of the most elite cultural institutions, which is the university. So they occupied the university in their own careers as academics, and they really intentionally believed, again, Stuart Jeffrey's book is good on this, they really intentionally believed that to affect the change, because again, that's another Marxist thing, right? The practical over contemplative pillar. To affect the real change that needed to happen, if it's a change that needs to happen in these cultural lines, like family, gender, race, then we need to occupy and change the place that produces these cultural ideas, the university, the academy. At least that's how it looks in America and the West more broadly. So that was an intentional intentional effort on the part of these critical theorists, starting in roughly speaking, the 30s or so, 1930s up through, especially the decades following that, into the 60s. And the student movements of the 60s were really, really influenced by this stuff. And I would argue that the general kind of culture of the university. And I have a background in student affairs administration in the universities, and I did college campus ministry for 8 years after that. So I mean, I have been immersed in this stuff, and I can speak anecdotally to the fact that the culture of the university has generally been really significantly influenced by these ideas. So that was an intentional effort. Marx didn't really talk about trying to target the universities to impact to affect his revolutionary ideas. He wanted the proletariat to wake up to their economic dispossession. The critical theorists, with all the other things I've said, shifted that to target the cultural institutions because of their goals. Now, it's also important to say, I want to add one more caveat to this. The critical theorists didn't all agree on this. Someone like Herbert Marcuse was actually very proud of the student movements and was very, very invested in seeing them furthered himself. Someone like Adorno actually was critical of Marcuse's work there and actually parted with him. And Adorno said that he thought that critical theory needed to remain theory. So he was actually not quite clearly Marxist in this sense, that you know, it needs to remain cerebral, abstract, and theoretical, not revolutionary on the ground. Whereas Marcuse talked very openly about furthering the student movements and being very proud of seeing the change that was happening there. So most of the revolutionary activity within critical theory that we see now, I would argue, is more Marcusean than it is Adornoian, if that's even a word. So, okay, so those are the three kind of things that I see that kind of help me wrap my mind around critical theory and cultural Marxism today. And in conclusion, I want to say, and I do want to do a video about like responding to all this. How do we respond to this, wherever you're coming from? How do you interrogate it? How do you think clearly about it? Hopefully defining it's a good first step. But in conclusion, cultural Marxism is a permutation of Marxism more broadly. It's not the same thing. In some ways, it's a lot more complicated. In some ways, it's a lot harder to pin down because it's targeting these invisible kind of cultural institutions in the air we breathe, so to speak. But it is different. And I think there are ways that you can identify cultural Marxism and critical theory in our world today, but I'm very, very leery of people loosely throwing the term around. So hopefully this was helpful to you. If you have questions or thoughts about this, again, comment below. Let me know what you think. Let me know if there's other things that would be helpful to dive into along these lines. But what I do want to do, I think, following on both of these definition videos, is I want to start diving into how does one respond to some of this. Again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you for my next video.